Welcome back to my course, World History. Last time we talked about the world of Islam, Muslim civilizations in the Middle East in the early modern age, from the 1400s to roughly the 1800s. One of the major conclusions we made last time was that how difficult and how uneven the world of Islam adjusted itself to the modern world. Remember, we mentioned that originally Arabic civilization had been highly developed in terms of science and arts, and then at a certain point, especially the time when Arabs were conquered by the Mongols, and then the Ottoman Empire was established. Slowly but surely, the world of Islam, from economic viewpoint, from a viewpoint of science, started to go down. And on the other hand, Europe, that was the backyard of the world, started to rise. We also mentioned that how suffocating the domination of Islam in the Middle East was for creativity, for science, for arts. Slowly but surely, as the nationalist leader of Turks, Kemal Atatürk, said, religion of Islam was like a heavy blanket that suffocated development of the Ottoman Empire. So there were obvious signs of decline, especially when Europeans rerouted the trade routes from the Middle East to Atlantic Ocean, to the Indian Ocean. Again, it didn't happen overnight, but eventually by the 1800s it was visible that the Ottoman Empire and other empires, Islamic empires in the Middle East, they were not able to successfully respond to the challenges of modernity, modern life. Okay, the reason I decided to stress this in the beginning is to alert you that today we're going to talk about a different civilization that was able to cope with the challenges of the modern world, that by chance was jump-started during the world of great geographical discoveries. Okay, if you look in our syllabus, you will see that the next in line is our lectures on Japan and China. So today we're going to talk about Japan. Japanese civilization that provided a different response to the challenge of modern life. Okay, Japan that was isolated at some point, that was unresponsive to challenges of the modern world, eventually reformed herself and found resources to completely transform herself by adjusting modern life or certain ways of the West, adjusting to the indigenous soil of Japan in order to successfully deal with these challenges, in order to become one of the Western countries, equally successful from economic viewpoint, equally powerful, which eventually, unlike other non-Western countries, allowed Japan to join the club of the big imperialist nations by the 1900s. Okay, so Japan, the civilization we are going to talk about today, is an example of a country that was able to successfully respond to the challenges of modernity. The country that was able, I repeat, unlike other many contemporary non-Western countries, to successfully join the club of Western countries. Okay, and moreover, Japan at some point was able to defeat one of the Western countries. So she received the recognition as one of the equals. So how it happened? Why it happened? What were the cultural and spiritual prerequisites in the Japanese civilization which allowed this country to deal with this modern life, to adjust modern ways to her indigenous soil? Japan in the early modern age. First, let me say a few things about geography of Japan. Geographically, Japan was very much isolated. Those of you who had the chance to read at least a little bit about the most ancient history of Japan, or Japan in Middle Ages, you will find out that the country was so isolated that it was never invaded by foreign invaders. Only once, during Genghis Khan time in 1240s, early Middle Ages, Japan was unsuccessfully invaded by Mongols, which were quickly defeated, rolled back, and that was it. The only time, the second time, when Japan was invaded, it was at the end of the Second World War, when American General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the specific operations of US against Japan, he presided over occupation of Japan. So Japan was occupied in 1945 by the American troops. Okay, that was it. Isolation. To some extent, Japan could be called a late bloomer. So what we call civilization, quote unquote, like state or organization of state, organized religion, organized state, organized bureaucracy. So it emerged in Japan in the early Middle Ages, 600s. Okay, so they were late bloomers, and many Japanese who belonged to the elite of society, they went to China to get this feedback, civilizational feedback. They borrowed the alphabet from China, they borrowed some religions from China, like Buddhism was brought from China, and layered over indigenous Japanese beliefs. Okay, but because of the security of Japan, remember I said Japan hardly was invaded, so it was pretty much secure. Japanese people did not develop this tradition of centralized power. Okay, in ancient times, in Middle Ages. Okay, there was no traditional centralized power, unlike China, where all power belonged to an emperor who was on the top. Okay, I'm sure if Japan hadn't been invaded, or constantly had been invaded, like India, China, Russia, I'm sure Japan would have created like a big centralized state. And she did later create for a while. Okay, for a short while. But since generally geography blessed Japan with such security that it was separated from continent by the sea, the rapid currents, okay, hardly any invasions, so Japanese people did not develop this traditional centralized power. I would like to emphasize this. Okay, in fact, in this respect, Japan was stood very close to Europe, where also in Middle Ages we could not find this traditional centralized power, where political power was decentralized, where feudal lords enjoyed a lot of autonomy, right? Remember we talked about it. So Japan very much resembled Europe in this respect. In fact, Japanese lords, like their European brethren, so to speak, like European feudal lords, were fighting each other, challenging each other. At some point in Japan, there was a period of warring states, or ongoing war, everybody against each other. The entire power in Japan was divided among three groups of people. Okay, it's like a pyramid, but better to say pyramid without a top. Okay, formerly there was an emperor in Japan. When I teach this class physically in a classroom, I usually draw a pyramid. I usually draw a pyramid without a top. Okay, and on top of this pyramid without a top, sorry for this redundance, I write the word emperor, okay? And then the second layer, shogun, which means commander-in-chief. And then this, the third layer of the pyramid, daimyo. So these were the three layers, okay? That's how Japan was ruled. On the one hand, Japan did have the emperor, but he did not have political power. He was more like a figurehead, okay, like a decorative figure, because of this decentralization of Japan, okay, since it was a warlike country. And historically, Japan was ruled by so-called daimyo. Daimyo were lords. It's a Japanese way to say feudal lords, local lords. By the 1400s, there were approximately more than 250 lords that controlled the entire territory of Japan, okay? They had their own castles, and they constantly challenged each other, okay? Constantly challenged each other. So, from time to time, these lords united in big coalitions. It was like a chaos, everybody against each other. But sometimes these daimyo lords united with each other, and they picked up so-called shogun, commander-in-chief. So one of the big daimyo, one of the big feudal lords who was able to be in charge of them. But again, he didn't have total power. For example, feudal lords daimyo were able to exercise financial independence. They taxed their own, they had the right to tax their own peasants, okay? The taxes didn't go directly to shogun, and of course taxes didn't go directly to the emperor. I repeat, the emperor traditionally in Japan was a figurehead whose major job was to take care of the spiritual life, religion. So the formal role of the emperor was to be in charge of a Japanese goddess patron called Amerisato. That's a goddess patron of Japan. In terms of religion, Japanese they could be called pagans, okay? They believed in spirits and many gods, pagans, okay? They worshipped nature, spirits of the forest, spirits of the mountains, and they had several major gods, and that's one of the patrons of their country. Not the entire country, but the central Honshu central island was Amerisato, okay, goddess patron. So he did not exercise, the emperor, he did not exercise political power. The political power was in hands of shogun, nominally, okay, in the hands of shogun, but the real power belonged to these feudal lords on the ground, okay, who constantly fought each other. Okay, so that is why I would like to put the emphasis on the lack of centralized state in Japan. It was just collection of provinces. Okay, these feudal lords, they acted as warlords, local warlords. Okay, so this system became known as the Shogunate System. So 250 lords, independent, recognizing a shogun for a while, not all the time. Okay, there were some people who challenged the power of shogun, competed with each other. Okay, so had total power in their own land estates. Since everybody was against each other, since Japanese daimyo, these lords, were constantly involved in the mutual wars, okay, they needed, like the European analogies, like feudal lords, special people who could fight on their behalf. Remember, in Europe, these were knights. In Japan, it was samurai. Remember, famous samurai. So that's, we can call them the Japanese knights. Okay, so they worked, quote unquote, or better to say, they fought for the interest of their lords. So each lord daimyo had samurai, a few samurai on his side. Okay, and these samurais were fighting each other on behalf of their lords. Constant fights, and of course, samurai transmitted their skills within the lineage. There was this group of samurai that the class of samurai, noble class, they never worked. they didn't do anything except fighting. That was the major job. Okay, so they were proud of this. They carried swords, and they lived by this code of behavior called the Bushido. Okay, the way of the warrior. So many of you might know about this. The reason I'm telling you about this, it's because it's very important for what we're going to discuss, like how Japan later had coped with these challenges of the modern world. So there was a big class of people called the samurai, whose job was fighting and nothing else. Okay, they were of course ninja. They were lower grade fighters like cunning spies, wreckers, of humble origin, not like samurai. Samurai were nobles, considered like noble people, but ninja were like cunning people, like tricksters in the middle of the night, hiding somewhere, like inflicting harm, backstabbing people, poisoning them. And finally, there was another group of warriors, monks, okay, called Sohei, warrior monks, who lived in monasteries, Buddhist monasteries. Buddhism came from China, okay. In fact, Buddhism was borrowed by the Japanese elite that wanted to build a centralized state. So that is why they brought Buddhism, because they wanted to use it. But samurai actually adopted Buddhism and turned assimilated Buddhism in their code of conduct. They developed Zen Buddhism, so it's a way of meditation for a warrior. And the Buddhist monks in Japan also organized monasteries / fortresses where they defended themselves, because everybody was against each other. So you had to know how to fight. So it's a warlike country, okay? Warlike country. And of course, after giving you this introduction into Japanese geography, culture, I would like to switch to what we're doing, for the past few lectures. Challenges of Europe, okay? Europeans who expanded overseas, they, of course, at first they reached India, Malaysia, Indonesia, then the New World, Central, Southern America, North America. But Japan and China were not exceptions in this case. They too became the object of expansion. So Europeans expand overseas, and Japan became one of those countries that also was approached by the Europeans with what? Offers to open a trade, with offers to accept Christianity. Okay, remember who went overseas trying to convert people? It was Catholics, remember? Because Catholics were upset that they had lost a lot of people. To whom? To Martin Luther, to Protestants, because Europe, 1517, remember, Reformation divided Europe into parts. And the Roman Catholics were very upset that they lost a lot of people. So many boats sent by the Portuguese Catholics, Spanish Catholics, they carried Catholic missionaries. So we have Europeans, and the first Europeans were the Portuguese, who come, Spaniards who come to Japan and China. They offer them firearms and Christianity. Okay, the most famous missionary who worked both in Japan and China was Francis Xavier. Remember, here in the United States, we have a Xavier University. It's a traditionally Catholic university founded by Jesuits. You know who Jesuits were, right? Because we talked about Jesuits when we discussed the Reformation. Okay, remember, Jesuits were very aggressive, spiritually aggressive people who wanted to reach out to people overseas, to bring them to the Roman Pope, to the Catholic Church. Some of them were ready to sacrifice their health. They went as far as just losing their lives in order to bring, quote unquote, lost souls to the true faith, to the Roman Pope, Catholic Christianity. So Xavier was one of them. The reason I mention this is that I want to draw your attention that Jesuits who came to Japan, they were able to convert 300,000 Japanese to Catholic Christianity. Okay, lords and peasants. Why? Because traditionally, and that's what I would like to stress again, traditionally Japan, even though she was an isolated country, traditionally Japanese tried to reach to other civilizations to borrow something. Remember I told you, when they started to build a state, organized state, religion, they went to China trying to copy something. Okay, so this mindset, a copycat mindset, was not a strange thing for Japanese. So they were okay with this, unlike some other civilizations who totally shut down themselves. Okay, so Japanese were fine with being copycats, with copying something from other people, as long as it was their own choice. Okay, so here we have Jesuits coming to Japan who were able to convert 300,000 people. Okay, because Japanese people were not monotheistic. Monotheism means when you believe in one God. They were pagans, open to many gods. So why don't we try this Christian God? Maybe it will help us. Who knows? So anyway, this desire to experiment things was widespread in Japan. So we have 300,000 people. It's a lot of people. I don't remember, unfortunately, exactly what was the population of Japan by the 1500s. I should have brought it, but I don't have right now with me. But still, it's a lot for old times, right? So these Japanese people who converted to Catholic Christianity, they layered, of course, Christianity on top of Shinto. Shinto, it was the indigenous religion of Japan, the way of nature, this paganism. And also on top of Buddhism, which had been brought from China. So many of them created this cocktail of spirituality, like a bit of Shinto, indigenous pagan religion, Buddhism, and Christianity. Some of them totally switched to Christianity. So it depends. It depends. So here you can see this Japanese drawing showing the Portuguese coming to Japan. So by the way, Portuguese were the first to come to Japan. Like, in case they were the first, remember, to create the empire, the overseas empire, the Portuguese, the first. Spaniards followed them, then the British, then the Dutch, French, but the first were Portuguese. And here again, we have the same country, Portugal, coming to Japan, establishing trade relationships. But at some point, both the Japanese samurai and lords, some of them who didn't accept Christianity, they became suspicious of the European penetration of Japan. Why? Because this very idea that these Japanese people had to be subjected to the power of the Roman Pope scared them. Okay, because Japan was a very much decentralized country. It didn't work well. So some of them were afraid, of course. The rumors were circulating that maybe we're going to be subjugated to the total control of this one center somewhere overseas. Okay, so was this fear of losing power. So we have, in addition to this interest in Catholic Christianity, we have an opposite movement, which was becoming more and more powerful to get rid of this Catholic domination. Okay, and that's when we have Shogun Tokugawa, so one of these daimyo, one of feudal lords, coming to the forefront. Okay, so basically Tokugawa was the shogun who decided to shield Japan from this European invasion. So we need to shut down this the spread of Christianity, otherwise we're going to lose our freedoms, okay, or independence. Freedom is not a good word to be applicable to those times. Let's say independence. So we need to shield Japan, all of us. Yes, we fight against each other, but still there's a major challenge, major threat overseas that we need somehow to build a firewall between us and these invaders who penetrated us on our own territory. So Shogun Tokugawa comes to power, and he establishes actually a dynasty of shoguns, okay? Because it was the time when Japan finally becomes a centralized state. Why? To challenge this invasion of Europeans, okay? First, Tokugawa kicked out the Catholic missionaries. We don't need you because you are invading us, you are hijacking us, spiritually hijacking us. We're not sure about you, who you are, okay? And he also pressured those Japanese who adopted Catholicism to quit Christianity. And some of them disagreed with this because they loved Christianity, so they went underground. And I don't know if you saw these manga cartoon movies, Japanese cartoon movies about the fate of Japanese Christians. I saw a whole series. I forgot the title of this. A series of manga, Japanese manga about the shogun fighting against Christians who were hiding underground. Anyway, there was a pressure on Japanese peasants and those lords and samurai who adopted Christianity to quit Christianity, okay? He also imposed trade restrictions on the trade with the West. But he didn't totally shut down Japan for the foreign trade. Tokugawa left one city to be opened for the European trade, and the city was the southernmost part of Japan, called Nagasaki. So Nagasaki area and the city of Nagasaki became the only place that was open to the Europeans to continue trade relationships. By the way, it was not all Europeans who were allowed to enter the city and to trade, okay? For example, the Spaniards and Portuguese were not allowed. Why? Because they were Catholic Christians who wanted to impose Christianity on them. Okay, now you can guess who was allowed. Protestants. Yes, Protestants were allowed because they were not so aggressive about promoting their faith, and especially who was welcomed. Again, I'm not talking about English people at that point. They didn't show up there yet. It was the Dutch. So the Dutch people, as we remember, the Dutch was the name for people who lived in the Netherlands, okay? So the Dutch was the only people who were allowed to visit Japan for a trade, and only in one city called Nagasaki, okay? And another important thing, Tokugawa made efforts to centralize the country, okay? Because he could not control these lords who continued to tax the peasants, because Tokugawa didn't have financial power. Plus, Tokugawa wanted to control the samurai who didn't want to listen originally, because they enjoyed the private wars fighting for the lords. But Tokugawa was not interested in private wars. You know, he thought the private wars would be harmful for the Japanese who wanted to organize resistance against the Europeans, okay? So he cracks down on samurai. He issues decrees, Tokugawa, to shut down the private wars. And that's how we have this so-called phenomenon of ranin. Ranin, it means masterless samurai. So samurai who lost their masters, okay? For example, Tokugawa said the daimyo, feudal lords, are not allowed to fight each other. So some lords had to release their samurai. So they had to let them go. We don't need you anymore. So that's how some of them became bandits, plenty of time on their hands. Some of them became vagrants, literally vagrants, wandering around the countryside, fighting with each other, robbing people. So there was plenty of time on their hands, okay? They were not allowed to fight anymore. They were allowed to wear swords as a symbol of their status. But what I'm just telling you, it's also important. So samurai were losing, not right away, but gradually losing their occupational zone. So they didn't have their quote unquote safe zone where they could fight. Okay, that was their job, right? So they were losing their zone when where they could exercise their skills. Okay, and they degenerated into banditry, drinking. A lot of them drank themselves to death, but some of them started to read. Some of them were curious about what was going on. So some of them tried to master different skills, or not because they wanted to work. They were, in fact, samurai didn't want to work to earn something, because in this case they could lose the face, right? Because they were noble class, they were not expected to work. Okay, so the shogunate issued them a stipend. Okay, some samurai got the stipends, but with plenty of time on their hands, they just started to get involved in different types of occupations. Sometimes it could be bad things, sometimes good things. I repeat, some of them started to read or learn certain trades just for fun, not for a job. So even though, and that's what I wanted to stress, even though the country was shut down, still the curiosity and inquisitiveness survived. It lived on in Japan. Okay, Western European books were smuggled into Japan. There was a lot of craving among the samurai. Remember, plenty of time on their hands. Cravings for Western books to read. So many books were translated from, especially the Dutch, into Japanese. Okay. There was an aspiration for book learning. Inks, pens were produced. Let's read about these dangerous foreigners. Maybe we can copy something useful from them. Maybe we can borrow something useful from them. Okay. Unlike some other civilizations that totally shut down themselves for the European trade, for the European knowledge, here we have an interesting phenomenon. On the one hand, the country did shut down herself, but on the other hand, there was this place remaining in southernmost part of Japan through which Western knowledge was trickling into Japan. Books, guns, certain devices, clocks. Okay. By the way, a couple of years ago, I was in Switzerland, and in Zurich, I went to an interesting museum. It was called the Museum of Clock. And for me, it was an interesting place because it was like a litmus test about scientific accomplishments of different civilizations. What I saw there a bunch of European and Japanese clocks. European and Japanese clocks. I didn't see clocks from my former home country, Russia. I didn't see their clocks and watches from the Middle Eastern countries. I didn't see many clocks from India or China. Why? Because there were hardly any there. But I did see in this museum clocks and watches from Europe and from Japan. It told me a lot. Okay, so in this case, it's like you cannot beat them. Okay, so I repeat, the country was isolated, but at the same time, the curiosity lived on, and the presence of a big class of people who had time on their hands, the samurai, worked well. Okay, for this. So the power, politically, the power was organized in Japan this way. On the one hand, we have shogunate. There was a capital where shogun lived, Ida, it's a shogunate capital. But the emperor, who was in charge, remember, religious life in Japan, he lived in Kyoto. It's a traditional ancient capital of Japan. But the power, of course, rested with the shogunate. Daimyo were still free to enjoy financial power. Okay. But in order to tame the feudal lords, daimyo, and samurai, Tokugawa acted like, let's say, his quote-unquote brother, royal brother. Okay, in France, remember I said, in France, Louis XIV, who said, "I am the state," he actually forced feudal lords to live with him in his palace in Versailles, because he wanted to control them. He was afraid that they might revolt against him. So here we have the same situation. Tokugawa shoguns, the whole dynasty, remember there were many of them. So 250 years we have this shogunate. So Tokugawa shoguns, they forced daimyo to reduce this local separatism, forced daimyo to spend some time of the year in the palace. Okay, so daimyo had to spend part of their time at the shogun palace. There was a form of control. They had to show that they were loyal to Tokugawa. Okay, and the samurai too. Samurai, in fact, were obligated to make visits to the shogun palace to pledge their allegiance. Okay, in fact, samurai spent a big time of the year traveling back and forth from the palace of Tokugawa and back, because they constantly had to pledge their allegiance. It created the whole industry, serving samurai visits, like a bunch of inns, or the small, using modern day language, motels, dineries for samurai to feed them on the way back and forth. Okay. So Tokugawa did bring peaceful life. So there were fewer mutual wars, domestic trade increased, and the class of people that grew in power was merchants. See, economy worked well. It was a monetary economy. Banking, credit expanded. Okay. In fact, some daimyo samurai got in debt because they started owing money to merchants. Japanese, I repeat, were eager to learn from foreign aliens. Okay. They wanted to borrow Western technology in order to improve Japan. Okay. But still, I want to repeat, Japan was closed for foreigners. Don't forget about it. The biggest challenge for Japan was the arrival of Commodore Matthew Peary, U.S. commander of a fleet that was sent to Japan to open up Japan for foreign trade. Okay, so let me briefly describe to you why Americans decided to sail to Japan in order to crack open Japan for a foreign trade. Okay, and it happened, I forgot to mention the years it happened. The visit of Matthew Peary happened in 1850s. Okay, so why it happened? It was because during the same years, or to be specific, from the 1830s to 1860s, Britain and France aggressively started to penetrate China. Okay, and in fact, they started fighting wars against China, and they were able to subjugate China. And we're going to talk about China next time. Okay, so the British and the French were very successful in taking over trade with China. They actually took over coastal cities of China. So it was a very lucrative business. Okay, and Americans also wanted to have a piece of this trade. So they were jealous, and they decided to go here. But China was already, excuse me, taken over in many respects. So they decided to sail to Japan to offer the Japanese, let's open a trade. Okay, so they didn't want to seize Japan, Americans, no. What they did, they came to Japan suddenly out of the blue. A fleet was sent, American fleet. They wanted to offer something to the Japanese, industrial goods. Remember, US became the second major industrial power. If I didn't tell you this, so I want to stress, after Britain. They brought a mini version of a steam engine. They brought guns like a Colt revolver. Okay, they brought this scientific device, the products of the Western scientific revolution, clocks, watches, of course, and to shock and awe Japanese people. And indeed, they were shocked and awed, okay? It was a big challenge. So they were amazed to watch these Western accomplishments, but at the same time, the Japanese people were afraid. They saw that they might fall the victims to this mighty power, okay? And it was a very ambivalent attitude on the part of Japanese. On the one hand, they were very suspicious of these evil foreigners who came because they were so powerful. But on the other hand, they said that, oh, they had such powerful knowledge, we need to get piece of this knowledge, okay? And that's what actually contributed to the rise of modern Japan, when the Japanese elite became divided in two groups, okay? One group of the Japanese elite said, oh no, we need to stick to the old life. We don't need these new things. But another part of the Japanese elite, it's like daimyo lords and samurai who had plenty of time on their hands, remember? They said, no, 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 we need to borrow from Western people useful knowledge, so-called enlightened samurai. See, I wrote it here. Enlightened samurai. We need to borrow useful things. But the first point on the bullet point on my slide, there's, see this expression, less samurai. So it's like a metaphor I'm using to label these old school samurais who didn't want any changes. He resisted any changes. They said, no Western knowledge. We have to kick out Western knowledge. Everything is evil. Okay. And the reason I'm using this metaphor of the last samurai, I would like to remind you that there is an old American movie. Some of you, especially if you are just from a high school, you might not remember this, but those of you who are older, so you might remember this. It's an American movie, I forgot, made somewhere or 10 or 12 years ago with Tom Cruise, and it's called The Last Samurai. I recommend you to watch this movie. You will see exactly what I'm telling you right now. It was, the movie was a good one, and it actually captured how these two groups of samurai were fighting each other from 1850s to 1870s. Okay, they were fighting each other, and the stakes were high. So whether Japan would shut down itself for European knowledge, like Ottoman Empire to some extent, or it would be totally opened to the Western knowledge and creatively assimilating the Western knowledge. So what are we going to do? So in this movie, Last Samurai, if you remember, Tom Cruise plays this American who becomes this quote-unquote noble savage. He joined this romantic old samurai who rejected the modern life. You know how in Hollywood romanticizes this like old style, this Native Americans who resist this Western civilization, or in this case, some old school samurai who resist the Western civilization, or you name them, you know. So it's in literature, in the movies, it's a widespread mythology. It's a part of the art. They romanticize these heroes of the old, okay, traditional society. So the same thing. So Tom Cruise, who plays an American who joined this old school samurai, he played one of these guys who used swords, spears, and horses against guns, cannons, and machine guns. And eventually, it's like a movie that shows that the old school of samurai were machine gunned by the new school samurai who adopted the Western knowledge, European guns, European cannons, European military tactics. Okay, and the end of the movie is a very memorable. It's basically a carnage of the old school samurai by a new Japanese army that was built according to Western standards. Okay, anyway, the Shogunate system was the symbol of the old Japan, symbol of the old. But the new school samurai decided to do a trick. Again, they didn't think about it. Of course, it's in hindsight, we can say it was an excuse. But at that time, in order to promote the modern knowledge, okay, to promote reforms, they wanted to reform Japan, to modernize Japan, okay. They decided to appeal to the emperor, who stood on the sides, and remember, the emperor didn't have any power. So they decided to use the emperor as the figurehead, as the symbol, as a centralizing force, to use him as an icebreaker to kind of destroy the shogunate system and to jumpstart the modernization of Japan. And that's what essentially done. It was done in Japan by the new school samurai, who decided to empower the emperor, who was weak, who was a decorative figure. So basically, and it was a very smart political decision, because people normally resist the innovations, novelties, but here the reformers, Japanese reformers, they said, hey, the emperor didn't have enough power, but we need to go to the past. Remember, in the past, he might have had more power, so it's our traditional spiritual force. It's our religious power, so we need to amplify this power. It's the symbol of the symbol of Japan as the country, okay? So we need to spiritually get united, and the emperor would be our spiritual anchor. See, it's a very important. Yes, he was impotent, didn't have power, but since he was in charge of this god and goddess patron of Japan named Amerisato, so he was our spiritual force. Let's use the spiritual force to get united, to modernize our country, okay, to withstand these Westerners. And that's how it was done. In 1868, we have this, I would say, coup d'etat, when the shogun was kicked out. So more than 200 years of the shogunate was destroyed. This dynasty was shut down, and the power was given to the emperor, Meiji, the dynasty of Meiji, okay? Meiji dynasty came to power. Again, the decorative figure that hardly had any power now became the power. I'm using the definitive article, the power, okay? The emperor was proclaimed the major source of power, the symbol that would unite Japan as the nation, okay? And in fact, the emperor, young guy, 17-year-old guy, who was used as a symbol by the progressive samurai and lords to jumpstart the modernization of Japan, okay? So behind his back, we have a bunch of reformers who said, we need to go to the West to learn the Western knowledge, Western military techniques, Western science. We have to bring railroads, Western universities. And he did follow what his advisors, progressive advisors, said. He started to abolish old order, okay? He crippled down the power of the samurai, further crippled down. He, of course, destroyed the shogunate system. He cracked down on the power of the lords. So what interesting he did? He introduced the new administrative division. So now it was not local land estates, castles that had the power. Now it became provinces, okay? Geographical provinces, territories, which had their own governors appointed by the emperor, to be specific, by his advisors, because he was young yet at that point, okay? In fact, the emperor agreed to go further in fulfillment of these ideas issued by reformers. He agreed to begin cooperation with the West. We need to establish peaceful relationships with the West. Yes, we're suspicious of them. They might take us over, but why can't we be friends with them? Because in this case, We can get there, and we might get the knowledge. We will send our own people to get educated. See, they were very proactive. They became very proactive. He started Meiji Emperor, whose picture you saw here. He started the Industrial Revolution. By what? By doing what? By sending hundreds of Japanese people, children of samurai and lords, to get educated in US, German, French universities, and inviting German, French, and American engineers to build factories, to jumpstart railroads and universities. For example, in 2003, 2004, I spent in Japan, in the city of Sapporo, where I did research for a year. And this university in Sapporo was, in fact, had been jump-started as an agricultural college by an American educator who was invited by the Japanese government. So that's what happened with many Japanese colleges who were jump-started by Westerners, invited by the Japanese government. Okay, and the same with the railroads, when German engineers were invited by the Japanese government to do this. Or the army, Japanese army was totally reformed according to German standards. Remember, Germans were considered the best soldiers at that time in Europe. So German officers were recruited, invited, paid by the Japanese government to build up the Japanese army. And in fact, in 1872, we have the military draft being introduced in Japan. Okay. So instead of samurai, there was a peasant army right now introduced by the government. Education was encouraged by the Japanese government. Okay. So we have a bunch of reforms, far-going reforms that went very far. Unlike, I repeat, the Ottoman Empire, where for religious reasons the government did not act so proactively like in Japan in assimilating the Western knowledge. In Japan, by the middle of the 1800s, we have already hundreds of Western books being translated in Japanese. Unlike, for example, in Middle Eastern countries, where you could count these books like 4 or 5 books only, or translated from Western languages into Arabic. The first dictionary, by the way, of a foreign language was published in Egypt, if I'm not mistaken, 1856. German-Arabic dictionary was the first dictionary published in the Middle East. But in Japan, a bunch of dictionaries were published, grammar books. So they studied foreign languages, Japanese foreign languages, in order to read foreign literature. It was, by the way, a very highly educated society. It's a very important. Okay. Calligraphy, art, education was very much appreciated in Japan. It was not only men, but also women, okay, were highly educated in Japan. So in this case, they were uniquely positioned to to digest this knowledge, learn this knowledge from Western Europe. Okay, so the culture itself was very much susceptible from the very beginning. So next time we're going to talk about China. So how China responded to Western challenges. That will be our topic next time. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you